Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that should be pretty interesting for a learner like you. It's called voluntary servitude.
Hey,
And, you've given us this really cool mix of sources this time around, historical texts, philosophical essays. We even have some more modern parallels. And they're all kind of asking this one question. Why is it that people choose to obey even when it's really obviously not good for them?
yeah, you know what I think is so interesting about this is we have this text from all the way back in the 16th century. It's Discourse on Voluntary Servitude by Étienne de La Boétie. We have that right alongside articles about modern day social media. And then we even have, your own personal reflections about your experience in the workplace. It's like this idea,
Yeah.
it transcends time and context. You know what I mean?
Totally. La Boétie was writing in a world of kings and tyrants and all that stuff, but somehow his ideas just feel super relevant even today. Like when he says that a tyrant's power doesn't really come entirely from, brute force, it actually relies a lot on the consent of the people they're ruling over.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think La Boétie uses this really striking analogy too. He compares people to animals that get tricked into, like a trap. He calls it bred circuses. It's like, distractions like entertainment or, giving people small handouts just as a way to maintain control.
It makes me think about, like social media and that endless scroll and, like you get caught up in the curated feeds and the dopamine hits and the likes and notifications. And, they're all designed to keep us coming back for more, even if it's, costing us our time and attention and even, our critical thinking skills. I mean, are we really that different from those animals La Boétie was talking about?
That's a good question. That's definitely something worth thinking about. La Boétie also gets into this whole idea of fear and how it gets used in propaganda to kind of manipulate the way people see things. He argues that a ruler, especially one that people don't really see in person, can become almost like this mythical figure, and that makes them easier to fear and therefore easier to obey.
And then you have, the people who actually benefit from the system. La Boétie points out that there are always going to be, individuals who are willing to work with those in power, because they're getting something out of it. Even if it means that other people have to suffer, it makes you wonder about the whole, complexity of being complicit in something. Like, how do people justify their choices even when they know they're contributing to something harmful?
Absolutely. And, the sources you've given us, they bring this whole thing, right into the 21st century. And that's where it gets even more complicated.
Right.
One of the sources actually focuses on the Belgian Congo and how they used coercion to force people into these labor contracts. It's like, even when you have, what looks like a signed agreement choice,
Yeah.
it can still be manipulated.
And it makes me think about what Kevin Bale says about fake contracts being used to hide exploitation. He's like an expert on modern day slavery. And it really makes you wonder about where the line is between, you know, choosing something freely and being forced into it.
Another source makes this comparison between a police lieutenant,
Yeah.
somebody who has really clear contractual rights and protections versus, a slave working on a cocaine plantation.
Yeah.
It's like it shows how different these power dynamics can be within these systems,
Yeah.
even when they might seem kind of similar on the surface.
It makes you wonder about how much choice we really have, when you factor in things like needing money to survive or feeling pressure from society to do certain things. Is it really a free choice? If the other option is losing your job or being, ostracized?
Yeah, it's a really tricky issue. And the sources, they actually offer some really interesting ideas about how these power dynamics show up in the modern workplace.
Yeah.
Like one of them even goes as far as to say that modern work culture, of all that focus on excellence and performance,
Yeah.
could actually be contributing to this kind of voluntary servitude thing.
Oh, that's interesting. How's
Well, just think about it. We push ourselves so hard, right? We accept these crazy demands. And a lot of times it's because we're afraid of what'll happen if we say no. Like we're afraid of losing our jobs or being seen as difficult or missing out on opportunities.
It's like we're giving up our freedom in exchange for some security. We cling to our jobs even if they're making us miserable.
Exactly. And this brings us right back to what La Boétie was saying about servitude becoming voluntary when we internalize it. Like when we start to believe that we don't have any other choice.
And then you add in all the distractions we have today, like the constant information overload and the pressure to stay connected all the time. It's no wonder people don't even realize that they're choosing to obey. It's like we're sleepwalking right into this, gilded cage.
And what's even more worrisome is how technology can be used to reinforce this whole thing. Like one of the sources talks about Facebook's privacy policy and how it basically creates this new form of voluntary servitude, because they're collecting all this data on us. We're basically trading our privacy for the convenience and connection that Facebook gives us.
It's like La Boétie's bread and circuses, but on a whole other level, we're so glued to our screens, so caught up in this whole digital show that we don't even see how our choices are being influenced.
And this connects to this bigger issue of surveillance and how data is being centralized. You see this happening not just with social media, but with governments and corporations too. The sources kind of paint this picture of how all our data is being collected and analyzed and used to shape our behavior.
It can feel a little overwhelming. So what can we do about it? Are we just destined to become, mindless followers manipulated by algorithms and seduced by convenience?
Not necessarily. One of the most empowering things I got from these sources was the emphasis on awareness. Like, the more we understand how these mechanisms of voluntary servitude actually work, the better we are at resisting them.
It's like once you see the matrix, you can't unsee it. You start questioning everything. Like, why am I doing this? Who's benefiting from my obedience? What are my real choices?
Exactly. And the sources actually give us some pretty compelling examples of how people throughout history have resisted servitude. You see it in ancient Greece, the French Revolution, the Civil Rights Movement, all these times when people collectively said enough and demanded change.
One of them even compares these historical struggles to the fight for freedom in the workplace today, like how labor unions and workers' rights movements came about as a way to challenge exploitation and give people more control over their work lives.
And it's not just about these big revolutions or social movements. The sources also talk about the psychology of resistance and how even small acts of defiance can be really powerful.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. When we challenge the status quo, even in small ways, we disrupt those patterns of obedience. It's like we're signaling to ourselves and to those in power that we're not just passive subjects.
So, like, what if instead of mindlessly scrolling through social media, we took a break and had an actual conversation with somebody about something that matters? Or what if we push back against an unreasonable deadline at work, even if it felt a little uncomfortable?
Exactly. Those little acts of resistance, they might seem insignificant on their own, but they're important in breaking the cycle of voluntary servitude. They remind us that we do have a choice, that we're not just cogs in a machine.
One source I thought was really powerful talked about the importance of critical vigilance. It's not just about being aware of the problem, but actually engaging with it, asking tough questions and demanding better.
And that's where your own thoughts about your work life are so valuable. They give us this real-world context for these abstract concepts. So what are some subtle ways that voluntary servitude might be showing up in your daily life?
That's a good question. I guess it could be things like staying late every night, even though I'm burnt out. Or maybe it's biting my tongue when I see something unethical happening. Or maybe it's just that feeling of being on autopilot, going through the motions without really thinking about why.
Those are the moments when we need to stop and ask ourselves, is this really what I want?
Yeah.
Am I acting out of fear, or am I making a genuine choice?
Because true freedom isn't about just doing whatever you want all the time, right? It's about having the awareness and the courage to make conscious choices even when they're difficult.
Absolutely. And the sources talk about some of the things in our minds that can keep us stuck in this voluntary servitude. One source explores Freud's theory about helplessness and how our fear of feeling powerless can actually lead us to be more obedient.
It's like we'd rather give up some of our freedom than face the possibility of feeling totally out of control. Which makes sense in a way, but it also makes us vulnerable to being manipulated.
And then there's the whole issue of how we're conditioned by society. From a young age, we're taught to respect authority, follow the rules, fit in. And while that's not necessarily bad, it can make it harder to question things even when they're harmful.
It reminds me of what La Boétie said about how we get so used to the burden of servitude that we forget what it feels like to be truly free.
But the sources also remind us that our ability to be free is always there. It's just waiting to be awakened. It's about recognizing the problem, questioning what we believe, and taking action, even if it's just baby steps at first.
It sounds like a lot of this comes down to reclaiming our own agency.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual liberation. The sources also emphasize how important it is to work together to challenge oppressive systems and build a more just world.
Right, because real change rarely happens when people are isolated. We need to support each other, make each other's voices heard, and work together to create a world where everyone has the chance to live a life that is truly their own. It's crazy how we usually think about servitude as this ancient thing,
Yeah.
like slavery or feudalism. But all these sources, they make it seem like it's still around us, just in ways that are more sneaky, more hidden.
Right. One source actually uses this term. It's kind of chilling. Social death. It's talking about what happens during slavery, like how a person gets stripped of everything, their identity, their relationships, their humanity.
Hmm.
And even though, like owning people as property is against the law in most places, these sources say this idea of social death, it can still happen with other types of exploitation and oppression.
That's kind of scary. Are there ways that we're being socially deadened without even knowing it? Are we like giving up parts of ourselves, our values, our dreams, just so we can fit in or just to survive?
The sources want us to really think about how modern institutions and systems might be part of the problem. They point to things like economic inequality, racial injustice,
Hmm.
the way privacy is disappearing in the digital age, all these forces that can wear down our sense of who we are and what we can do.
And I bet it's not just stuff outside of us. The sources probably talk about how we internalize these oppressive messages and end up playing a part in our own oppression.
You got it. One source talks about this idea in psychology called learned helplessness. It's where we get so used to feeling powerless that we don't even try to change things anymore.
So it's like we give up before we even begin because we've been trained to think we can't win. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly. And the sources say that this feeling of helplessness gets stronger because of the very systems that benefit from us being obedient. They use propaganda distractions, even small rewards, to keep us from making trouble and keep us from questioning the way things are.
It's like that saying, the best way to control someone is to make them believe they're free. But with all this talk about control and manipulation, the sources must offer some hope, right? We can't just end on a downer note.
You're right, they do.
Yeah.
They remind us that we always have the capacity for freedom and agency. It's never completely gone, no matter how buried it might seem. It's about rekindling that spark inside, remembering who we are and what we can do.
And I think this is where the whole good life conversation comes in. I remember one source talking about this philosophical debate about what it means to actually live a life that's fulfilling and meaningful.
Exactly. And it challenges this idea that happiness comes from having lots of money or power. Instead, the sources say that real fulfillment comes from living in a way that matches our values, building strong relationships, and contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
So it's about matching what we do with what we believe and finding a purpose that's not all about material stuff. That makes a lot of sense.
It does, and it brings us to this idea of voluntary recognition, which one source digs into. It says we get to choose who we respect and admire. It's not about blindly following authority figures. It's about choosing to connect with people and ideas that inspire us and help us grow.
So it's about consciously choosing who and what we give our energy and attention to. It's about actively participating, not just passively accepting.
Exactly. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about finding your voice and speaking your truth.
No.
It's about choosing to recognize and support those who are fighting for a more just and equitable world and having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's not popular.
As we wrap up this deep dive into voluntary servitude, I'm left with this feeling of possibility. Yeah, the world is complicated and challenging, and yeah, we're all vulnerable to being manipulated and controlled in different ways. But these sources, they remind us that we're not powerless. We have a choice.
And that choice starts with awareness. The more we understand how power works and the sneaky ways that voluntary servitude operates, the better we are at resisting it, and the more we develop our own inner sense of freedom. Our ability to think critically and act bravely, the more we can help create a world where everyone has the chance to live a life that's truly their own.
So as always, we'll leave you with a question to think about. What small act of defiance, what brave choice will you make today to reclaim a little bit of your autonomy? Because it's in those little moments, those quiet acts of rebellion, that we start to shift the balance of power and create a ripple effect that can change the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.